Well, in 2009, the author and speaker Simon Sinek shot to fame when he gave a TED Talk called Start With Why. Anybody seen that? No, one person has seen that. Well done. You get a gold star, Alistair. Well done. All right, well, it is 2009, so we're talking about, 15, 16 years ago now. But his basic premise was that the main thing that differentiates organizations that are prospering and flourishing and organizations that are just plateauing or maybe declining is not like the talent level of their employees or the amount of capital that they have to invest in their organization or the economic conditions that they're operating in. He argues that the main thing that separates companies that are growing and flourishing from companies that are declining or plateauing is that the companies that are doing well, they know their why. In other words, they don't know just what they do or what products they make or what services they provide. They know why they provide them, and furthermore, they really believe in it. And as an example, Sinek talks about Apple. And Apple, their why is they want to challenge the status quo and everything they do to make the world a better place. And they encapsulated this in the motto, think different. And for them, thinking different meant designing products that were beautiful to look at, really simple to use, and really simply designed. And it was that motto, that why, that led to the invention of this. You know, there was a time when there are a few of us here who can remember when this was, we didn't, when a phone was only used for making phone calls. Are there a few of us here that remember those days? A few, yeah, a few. There's a whole, that was 18, these came out in 2007. So we're 18 years into it, which means there's a whole generation of people that don't realize that a phone is primarily for talking to other people. Now that's like the last thing you want to use it for, right? No, but Apple knew their why. They wanted to change the world by thinking different, and so they completely reimagined what a phone could be, what it could look like, how you would use it, and for better or for worse, they've changed the world. And Sinek argues that the reason why it's so important to know your why is because knowing your why determines everything else. It determines what you're going to do and what you're not going to do. It determines what you value and what you don't value. It determines what you define as success and what you define as failure. And his argument is that as individuals and as businesses and as organizations and even as churches, it's really essential to define your why, to understand the why that lies behind the what. And so for the next few weeks, we're going to talk about the why. Why do we do what we do as a church? And to put it really simply, we actually put this in our vision as a church. And our vision is this: we are a community being transformed into the image of Jesus for the sake of others. That is the why behind the what. That's not only what we do, that's why we do it. And the beating heart of that vision statement is right there in the middle. We are a community being transformed into the image of Jesus for the sake of others. It is that, our transformation into people who think like Jesus, who live like Jesus taught us to live, is essential. It's the fountain out of which everything else flows. Everything else that a church should be comes out of you and I becoming people who look more like Jesus every day. So if you want authentic Christian community, you got to become more like Jesus. If you want to, every missional endeavor the church wants to take on, it flows out of us becoming more like Jesus. That is our number one priority as a church, is to help you become more like Jesus. That is our why. And if you look at the New Testament, you'll find this whole idea of transformation emphasized over and over and over again. We don't have time to go through all the examples this morning, but I just want to run through a few of them together just to kind of drive this idea home a little bit. So in Colossians 3:10, it says, "Put on your new nature and be renewed as you learn to know your Creator and become like Him." In 2 Corinthians 3, it says, "Now the Lord is the Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. And we all, who with unveiled faces contemplate the Lord's glory, are being transformed into His image." Or Romans 8:29, "For God knew His people in advance, and He chose them" what? To go to heaven? What is He choosing them for? He chose them to become like His Son, to become like Jesus. But one of my favorite passages that talks about this comes from Paul's letter to the Galatians, and we call it the book of Galatians, but actually it was a letter. And if you know Paul, what he did, he was the first great missionary in the early church, and he traveled around the Mediterranean, establishing churches in different locations. And then he would start a church, he'd win people to Jesus, he'd disciple them for a while, and then he'd move on to the next city and do the same thing. And then he'd get updates and reports. How's it going in this location? And they'd ask questions, and they'd say, hey, we're having this issue. And so he'd write these letters. And most of our New Testament is the result of Paul writing letters back to churches that he started. And so this particular passage comes from a letter that he wrote to the people in Galatia, which is in modern-day Turkey. And they're writing him, they're asking him these questions, and Paul responds to them. And just in this kind of fragment before he launches off on this long explanation of things, he says this. He says, "Dear children, for whom I am again in the pains of childbirth until Christ is formed in you." And then he goes on to talk about what they need to do to have Christ formed in them. But I just want to hone in on this statement for a minute. This interests me for a couple reasons. First of all, I just want to maybe correct Paul on his use of metaphor here. If you're a guy, just want to give you a little tip, a little word of advice. Never compare, I don't care how much pain you're in, never compare your pain and anguish and suffering to giving birth to a child. I have tried this a few times with Lauren, and it has not gone well. I would especially caution you about using this metaphor in the presence of a woman who's actually given birth, because you might actually experience a pain worse than childbirth if you say that to a woman about how much you're suffering. So Paul does not, I wish we probably could have chosen maybe a different metaphor. However, he was single, sometimes, as guys, before we get married and all that, we say some dumb things. So let's just kind of gloss over that a little bit. But Paul, his point is pretty profound here. He is saying, think about what a woman in labor goes through to deliver a child into the world. In Lauren's case, I got to be a part of her bringing 4 children into the world, and the amount of pain and suffering she went through every time after she had a child, and we were contemplating having another one. I was like, are you serious? Do you remember what you went through to bring that child into the world? Like hours of pain and agony, and it was traumatic for me to watch. I can't imagine what it was like for you to experience. And yet, that's what Paul is saying. He's saying, hey, I care so much that Christ is formed in you. I'm in agony over this. I'm working really hard that Christ be formed in you. Let's go to the next slide. That's the key. He's really focused on this idea that Christ is formed in these people. That's what he's laboring for. That's what he's after. That's what he's praying for. That's what he's writing these letters for. He knows this is critical. This is essential. I think it's not too much of an exaggeration to say that Paul knew that Christ-likeness happening in these people was the future of the church hinged on whether or not the people of God began to actually live in a different way, began to live like Jesus. He knew this was
critical and foundational to everything else that was going to come. And so he was laboring for it with all of his might. This was the goal for him. And Paul also knew that formation, this idea of being formed into the image of something, is a battle. You see, formation isn't just a Christian thing. Formation is a human thing. You and I are all being formed into the image of something or someone every minute of every day. Whether it's the media that comes through our phones or our education systems or the different, our culture, our society, all the different messages that we're getting, they're all forming us into different things. They're getting us to value this thing or value that thing or like this thing, hate that thing. We're being formed every minute of every day, whether you're a Christian or not. So the question is, what are you being formed into? And Paul's exhorting us. He's saying, don't become like the world. In fact, he says it this way in Romans 12:2. He says, don't copy the behavior and customs of this world, but let God transform you into a new person by changing the way you think. And that word transform there comes from the Greek word, the Greek word there is metamorpho, which is where we get the word metamorphosis from, which is, of course, what describes, a caterpillar turning into a butterfly. And that's the kind of degree of transformation we're talking about here. We're becoming a completely different creature. It's a supernatural process where this little wiggly caterpillar becomes a beautiful butterfly, and that is the idea that Paul is getting across here. And he knows that this is going to be a battle. He's saying, hey, don't be conformed to the world. The world is trying to shape you in its image and value the things it values and want the things it wants. And he's saying, don't be conformed to the world. Instead, be transformed to become like Jesus. So the question we have to ask ourselves continually is, what kind of person are you being formed into? Are you becoming the kind of person, if you took your life, looked at the trajectory of your life right now and extrapolated it out 10 years, what kind of person are you being formed into? What kind of person will you be in 2035? Are you going to be more like Jesus? Or are you going to be more like something or someone else? It's a critical issue for all of us. So Paul was exhorting these people over and over again throughout the New Testament, hey, let's be formed into the image of Jesus. Let's become like him. This is, as a Christian, that's what you've signed up for. There's all kinds of words for this. We can call it sanctification. We can call it spiritual formation. We can call it discipleship. But the whole idea is that we are, as followers of Jesus, becoming like Jesus. In fact, I say it this way. The Christian life is the lifelong process of being transformed to be like Jesus. Have you ever thought about it that way? That's what it is. The Christian life is the lifelong process of being transformed to be like Jesus. So, what does that mean? We need to define that. If the goal is to become like Jesus, it's good to actually spell that out a little bit. What does it mean to become like Jesus? Does it mean we need to dress and live like a first century rabbi in Israel? No, of course not. Nor is it a list of long rules and do's and don'ts. And as I thought about this, how do we define Christ-likeness? There's all kinds of different ways to define it. In fact, you just read the New Testament, and that's one big definition of what Christ-likeness looks like. But to boil it down, I want to highlight three different things. First of all, Christ-likeness looks like the fruit of the Spirit. Paul cites 9 different characteristics or traits that describe who Jesus is and what he's like. You remember them, right? Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. He's saying that if you sat down and had a conversation with Jesus, you would feel all of these things coming from that. That's who he is. And so when the Spirit of God comes and dwells inside of us, he begins to develop this fruit in our life. He's going to make you into a more loving person. He's going to make you into a more joyful person. Well, some of us could really use that. I heard one speaker once say, like, hey, the Spirit of God lives in you, and the Spirit of God is full of joy, but maybe you need to notify your face of that, For a lot of us, we need the joy of the Lord to actually shine through us. The Spirit of God is making you a more peaceful person. Gosh, don't we all need that in this anxious and worried world where so many of us are plagued by anxiety? The idea of God making us a more peaceful person, that brings hope to my heart. More patient person. I think about this every time I get stuck behind a driver who's driving under the speed limit and I can't overtake them. I'm like, here we are. My patience is being matured right now. I'm developing the fruit of patience in my life. Kindness. God's developing us into a kinder people. Goodness. Faithfulness. A more gentle person. A more faithful person. A more self-controlled person. That's what God is working on in your life. He's developing that as fruit, and it's growing in your life, and different ones are developing at different rates, but the idea of living out the fruit of the Spirit is what it means to be like Jesus. The second way of thinking about it is basically living out the Sermon on the Mount, particularly embodying the Beatitudes. Think about the Beatitudes, Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are the merciful. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are the meek. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. Blessed are those who are peacemakers. And blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Those traits define what a Christ-like person actually looks like, how they live and conduct their lives and conduct their relationships. And there's just a treasure of wisdom and revelation in each one of those statements. And at some point, we will go through all of those and unpack what Jesus was meaning when he talked through, when he gave us the Beatitudes, because you look at those at first and it can seem kind of confusing, like, blessed are those who mourn? That's what it means to be Christ-like? Well, so much of, a lot of us go through life without even our hearts are like numb to all the pain and brokenness in this world, and we, to actually allow our hearts to feel is a significant step towards what it means to be like Jesus. There's so much more I could say about that. It's a whole different sermon. But maybe a third way to define what it means to be like Jesus is it's somebody who obeys the great commandments. Remember, Jesus was asked by somebody, he said, okay, what are the great commandments? And he said, love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and mind and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. In other words, you're becoming a person of love, a person who loves and delights in God, and a person who loves the people that surround your life, a person who puts other people first, a person who loves sacrificially. That's the kind of person God is shaping you into. And notice with these traits, there's not a lot of rules there, are there? There's not a lot of do's and don'ts. There's not a long list of like, hey, a Christian should never drink alcohol, or a Christian should never dance, or a Christian should never do this or that. Instead, what it gives us is an attitude, qualities of the heart that embody the character of Jesus. That as we embrace these things, we become a people who love what Jesus loves, who hate what Jesus hates, who value what Jesus values, who would do what Jesus does if he were in our shoes in every situation. That's what it means to be a disciple. Being a disciple of Jesus is built around three things: being with Jesus, becoming like Jesus, and doing what Jesus would do. And when we talk about Christ-likeness, it's not about like, hey, I gotta obey all these rules now. Instead, it's about becoming transformed from the inside out. You see, Christianity is an inside-out religion. It's about a transformation of the heart, a transformation of the mind, a transformation of our attitudes and our appetites and our desires. It changes us from the inside out. It's not an external thing that's being imposed on us. It's something that comes from within us. The prophet Ezekiel talked about this when he was looking into the future, and God was speaking to him about what was going to happen one day when God poured out his Spirit. And he talks about when the Spirit of God comes to live inside you, this is what he says: I will give you a new heart and put a new spirit in you, and I will take out your stony, stubborn heart and give you a tender, responsive heart. And I will put my Spirit in you so that you will follow my decrees and be careful to keep my regulations. In other words, God's not just going to give you this big, long list of things to do. What he's going to do is put his Spirit in you that's going to guide you and lead you and counsel you and correct you and show you what you should do and show you what you shouldn't do in any and every situation. And if we keep our hearts soft and open to him, then we will naturally find our way into God's way of doing things. It's an inside-out transformation. It's about moving from external prompts, like in the Old Testament, we get the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments were just a starting place. It moves far beyond that into this sort of inner transformation of our hearts, of our attitudes, of our appetites, of our desires, and it forms us into a completely different person. So that's what we're about as a church. We want to help you embrace this idea that actually the most important thing in my life is to become a person who looks like Jesus, who lives as Jesus would live if he were in my shoes. And so everything we do as a church, that is our priority, whether it is having a men's fire or a women's retreat or a solitude retreat or gathering together on a Sunday or listening to a sermon or training our kids or meeting in life groups, going on mission trips. Everything we do is done with this ultimate aim that we want to help you become like Jesus and experience the life that he died for you to have. Now you might be wondering, hey, what about outreach? What about mission? Aren't we supposed to be missional? What about the lost? Well, outreach is one essential aspect of what every church does. But my belief, and I believe this is what the New Testament teaches, the most evangelistic thing you could ever do is intentionally embrace this process of transformation to becoming like Jesus. Remember what I said, becoming like Jesus is the fountain out of which everything else flows. If you're just simply moved, a lot of us are moved by compassion for the injustice in the world or the lostness of the world, and we want to go out and we want to fix all those problems. But if it's just you trying to fix things, you're going to burn out inevitably. There's just this long process of people with good intentions. They go out, they try to do things, but it just kind of filters away. But when you become a person that's like Jesus, it's motivated from a different source. There's a different power that's coming through you that impacts the world around you. So I think becoming like Jesus is actually the most evangelistic thing you could ever do. Jesus put it this way in the Sermon on the Mount. He said in Matthew 5, he said, "You are the light of the world, like a city on a hilltop that cannot be hidden. No one lights a lamp and then puts it under a basket. Instead, a lamp is placed on a stand where it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your good deeds shine out for all to see, so that everyone will praise your Father in heaven." Now, what's interesting is this comes relatively early in the Sermon on the Mount. The rest of the Sermon on the Mount could be interpreted as the explanation of good deeds. What are these good deeds that Jesus is talking about? Is he talking about caring for the poor? Is he talking about sharing your faith? What is he talking about? Certainly it includes those things. But actually, it's really interesting what Jesus talks about from that point forward. You know what he talks about? He talks about how you deal with your anger. He talks about how you handle your sexuality. He talks about how you treat your spouse. He talks about what you do with your money and your possessions. He talks about how you handle your words and the power of your words. He talks about anxiety and how you handle worry and anxiety in your life. You see, the people that aren't Christians, they're actually watching us to see, is there anything to this faith that you have? Is there anything that makes your life different? And Jesus is saying, hey, your difference, your Christ-likeness is going to show up in these places. I mean, that's getting real, isn't it? What if those areas, if we just started with those areas, if those were transformed, would that not make people sit up and take notice and start asking questions? And then, when the questions are asked, and as Peter exhorted us, hey, we need to be ready to give an answer for the hope that we have within us. But it's our lives that provoke the question. It's our lives that are causing people to say, well, what's different about you? Why are you doing this? What gives you this hope that you have, even in really difficult circumstances? Why do you forgive your enemies? How do you love your wife so well? Things like that. So this is one of the most missional things you could do is become like Jesus. But think about it the other way. If you refuse to go on the transformational journey, you think, hey, like my ticket is punched, I believe in Jesus, but I'm really enjoying my life right now. I really don't want to change. I want to just, I'll repent later. Think about it this way. What do you call a person who says they believe one thing but does another? A hypocrite. And when you read through the Gospels, Jesus had his strongest words were against religious people who said one thing and did another. People who were hypocrites. Woe to you, Pharisees, hypocrites. He just railed. He had some strong things to say to them. He called them broods of vipers and whitewashed tombs. I mean, he was harsh with them. Because Jesus knew that people that proclaimed God, that said, hey, I'm a believer, but then lived another way, was probably the most destructive thing to the kingdom of God going forward. The author Brennan Manning put it this way. He said, the greatest single cause of atheism in the world today is Christians who acknowledge Jesus with their lips, walk out the door, and deny him by their lifestyle. That is what an unbelieving world simply finds unbelievable. As I said, the world is watching. What does Jesus do for you? If they see you proclaiming one thing but living another, they're like, there's nothing to this. But if they see a life transformed, then they start to lean in. And then you have an opportunity to proclaim Jesus in a way that is compelling, in a way that actually matters, in a way that sticks with people. And whether there's a moment of conversion right there, or whether it's just planting a seed for the future, a transformed life speaks louder than words. So that's what we're about as a church. We exist, we're a community to help you become a person who is made in the image of Jesus for the sake of others. And everything we do is to that end. So we're going to come alongside you. We're going to encourage you. We're going to help you. We're going to exhort you. We're going to teach you. We're going to admonish you when necessary. But the whole goal of this is to help you become like Jesus, to help you be the light of the world everywhere that God places you. And if that excites you, if that stirs your heart, then that's where we're going as a church. That's what we want to be. We want to be a people, a community, being transformed into the image of Jesus for the sake of others. So I want to end with just a couple of questions for you. And I just want to return to that question first that I asked earlier. What kind of person are you being formed into? If you were to take the trajectory of your life today and extrapolate that out 10 years from now, in 2035, who are you going to be? What kind of person are you going to be? You know, Dallas Willard says that the most important thing you have to give to God is the person you become, because that is what you take with you into eternity. He's right about that. So who are you becoming? What kind of person are you becoming like? Are you becoming like Jesus? Or are you becoming like someone else? And I don't say that, look, every single one of us faces that battle all the time. And we have to constantly return to this and re-up this. And that's why I'm talking to you about it this morning, is we just have to remember the why. What are we after here? We're after becoming like Jesus, and that's why we say no to so much of what the world has to offer. Maybe you need to spend some time with that question. What kind of person are you becoming? What is really shaping your life? Is it the scriptures? Is it Jesus? Or is it something else? The second question I want to ask you is, what area of your life is God transforming right now? Where's God at work in your life? And I think it's probably, I want you to think of this as just what area, like one area is God working on. Because God is kind, he's good. He doesn't like want to overwhelm you and say, hey, we're just going to overhaul the whole thing. Think of it like a mechanic who's fixing up an old car. It's one piece at a time. Like, they don't do the whole thing at once. It's just, they get a part in, they put it on the car, they repair this, they fix that dent, they repaint this, they do that. Little by little, the car gets restored. That's how God works with us. He just works little by little. He's going to put his finger on one thing or another, and over time, we begin to change. We begin to be transformed. Maybe he's saying, hey, we're going to work on patience this year. Maybe this year we're going to learn how to be a peacemaker. Maybe right now we're working on the anxiety and fear that's just crippling your life. I mean, it could be anything, really. But he just works one thing at a time, one thing at a time. And so what is he working on in your life right now? Last week, if you were here, we talked about, we encouraged you to ask God what his counsel is for you in 2025. What is his counsel? Like, what is he guiding you into? But I bet if you go back and review what you heard from God last week, what you would find is that the things that he's highlighting is probably at least one area of transformation in your life. And so my question is, do you remember what God spoke last week? And if so, have you done anything about it? If you missed last week, you can go back and watch it on YouTube. We just spent our whole time really just listening to God, processing last year, asking God what he had for us in the year ahead. So you can go back and catch that if you want. But if you were here, what did you sense from God, and have you done anything about it? What actions have you taken? And if you're stuck, if you're like, I haven't done anything, a lot of us need to just tell at least somebody. Sometimes it really helps to just verbalize, hey, this is what I feel like God's put his finger on in my life right now. Would you just kind of ask me about this every now and then? A lot of times just this simple accountability, not getting weird and some sort of manipulative control thing. I find it really helps me to just say, hey, I need help with this. Can you just ask me about this every now and then? That really helps. Or maybe you feel really stuck. And if you do, we're going to have our prayer team down here in a minute. And we would love to just pray with you today. If you feel like God's working on something in your life, but you feel stuck and you feel hopeless, I want you to hear that you don't have to stay there today. And when God puts his finger on something in your life, it's not to condemn you or shame you. It's because God is full of hope for you. Because he sees the person you can become when you become a person who's made in the image of Jesus. He wants to set you free and let you and have you experience the freedom that Jesus died to give you. That's what this is about. So if you need prayer this morning, we're going to have our team up here in a minute. And worship team, if you want to make your way down. Where is God transforming your life right now? If you'll give yourself and be intentional about that one thing, you'll be amazed at how much can change in the next year, the next 10 years. You know, it's often said we overestimate what we can do in a day, but totally underestimate what we can do in a year. So just trust that as we take that next step with God, he can actually do deep, transformative work in your life. So that's what we're here to do as a church. That's what we're after, helping you become a people who can be like Jesus. Let me pray for you. Jesus, thank you that you loved us so much that you haven't abandoned us, but you have come, you've laid down your life so that we could be reconciled to you and become like you. Lord, we pray that you would take, as a church, that you would take us from being a people who are just naturally conformed to the world and transform us into a people who look like you. Help us become like Jesus in our words, in our thoughts, in our deeds, and in our desires. Lord, show us what is forming us. A lot of it is subconscious. A lot of it is happening in ways we don't even realize. Show us when the world is shaping us. Make us alert to us. Make us wise and discerning. And Lord, I pray that you would help us to be shaped by you. Show us what that means in this time, Lord. How do we connect with you? How do we let you shape us rather than the world? And Lord, I pray that you would, again, highlight to us that area where you're working in our lives. That we could join in with what you're doing and be transformed in this area. And over time, become like you. It's in your name we pray. Amen. Let's stand as we close in worship. And I want to invite the prayer team, if you could come be over here. So our prayer team is going to be standing over here. And if you need prayer this morning, whether it's what I've been talking about or something completely different, we would love to pray for you. So our prayer team's going to be over here, and I just want to encourage you to go ahead and come. We'd love to pray for you while worship is happening, but for the rest of us, let's sing together.